Very glad to have David Montgomery back to talk about his latest book. He is a professor at the University of Washington, a soil expert, geomorphologist, and food eater, but also a food expert. Really, I think I call you a soil expert because that's how I was introduced to you, but you have helped me understand much better the food I'm eating, I guess, based on a better understanding of what's going on with soil, and not a topic that's often really discussed, David, when we're talking about issues with agriculture, not just here, but globally. Maybe we could just start with your book, What Your Food Ate. You just published this with your wife. Give us the premise. What's the problem that you identify, and is it different from your previous works?
Yeah, well, the main thrust of What Your Food Ate is a question that was really sort of left on the table for Anne and I, to pardon the pun, after writing some of our other books, and that's the question of what potential difference can regenerative agriculture, farming practices that build the health and fertility of the land as a consequence of intensive farming, what difference does that make to the kind of to what's in the food that we eat? And so we basically spent a few years looking into the connections between how farming affects the health of this land, the health of the soil, and how soil health translates up into the health of crops, livestock, and people. And as you might imagine, there's a lot of dots to connect in between there. And that's why, working with Anne, who's a biologist, was really sort of central to thinking about this, because as a geologist, I trained in looking at sort of a piece of the puzzle in terms of looking at soils, and Anne's trained and the other half, the biology half. And so we essentially went through the whole connections of breaking the book into sections on looking at how farming affects soil health, how that translates into crop health, animal health, and human health. And, soil health is not the only thing, obviously, that affects the health of people or crops or animals. Lots goes into it. And for us, our genes, whether we get any exercise, what we choose to eat, they all really matter as first order impacts on our health. As well as the characteristics of the environments that we live in and toxins and all those other kind of things. But we were really curious after writing our previous books, The Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, The Hidden Half of Nature, Growing Revolution, that looked at the practices that had degraded land in the past and how we can turn that around with regenerative agricultural practices as a long-term plan for securing agricultural sustainability. But we really wanted to look at what it meant for what's in our food. So we took a few years to dive into that. And What Your Food Ate is the product of the looking at those connections. And there's pretty solid scientifically backed threads that one can draw through that whole connection. Obviously, it's very difficult to go straight from soil health to human health with all the pieces that are in between. But if you break it up into the links in between, there's pretty solid evidence that the way we treat the land ultimately affects what is getting into our food. And it's not as simple as the story of conventional versus organic agriculture. It's a more interesting, I think, exploration of the role of soil health in building soil fertility and the health of whole societies, but also how that translates down into what we can kind of think of as maybe thinking of food as preventive medicine. Because it turns out that a lot of the things that farming practices affect that demonstrably change what's in our food relate to the presence of things like phytochemicals, antioxidants, anti-inflammatories, the mix of fats that we have in our meat and dairy, things that are actually related to in terms of human health are related to chronic diseases more than acute diseases. So you can think of, thinking of food as preventive medicine and thinking of how the way we raise our food may play into that. We can think about it as a connection that really helps prime our immune system and our bodies to be as healthy as they can be, given all the other circumstances that affect our health. And sorry, that's a long answer to your question, but it was a fun book to research. We got to dive into a whole lot of areas, as you might imagine, piecing together links from different disciplines. But we're really happy with how it came together, mixing the history of science, history of key individuals that have looked at these connections over time, and our own stories of actually going around visiting farmers and doing some research on the nutrient density of crops ourselves.
I have a lot of people who follow the interviews that I do on agriculture who are very interested in that term regenerative farming and are completely like, on board with everything that you've talked about with the health of the land and its effect on the health of our food, and then thereby our health, but are also, I think, watching closely like what's happening in the Netherlands, for instance, where there's been protests for several weeks now, and this dates back actually several years, over nitrogen and ammonia emissions, and I think are wondering, okay, how do you move in the direction that you're talking about without getting this? And what's the role of government in all of it?
Yeah.
And how do you avoid this? Because a lot of farmers feel under attack. I should say that. I hear that a lot.
Yeah, and what you don't do is you don't attack farmers. I mean, if you're thinking about sort of changing agriculture towards in a more regenerative direction, farmers should be your first ally, not somebody to attack. And so the wrong way to go about it would be to do it by fiat and mandate on short order. Because if you have farms and farming systems that have come to depend on lots of inputs, lots of nitrogen, fertilizer, lots of well, I guess in the Dutch case, they're basically looking at livestock and trying to basically greatly limit livestock reductions. If we don't livestock-related emissions, and reducing them, if we don't look at how to get there in a way that actually works for farmers, it's just not going to work. And so when we think about a change, we should be thinking about what are the options, what are the alternatives, how would you actually get there? And I don't know enough about the details of the Dutch case to know exactly how most of the livestock that's in question, that I believe to be the focus of these protests, is actually managed. But the basic idea behind the law, as I understand it, is to limit, basically to move towards limiting livestock production as a way to limit greenhouse gas emissions. And the thing that's really missing in that is to actually look at, well, are there better ways to actually raise livestock? The question, how are we actually raising them? And there are other alternatives to manage the transition. And that applies, equally to regenerative crop production as it does to animal agriculture.
I was just scrolling through some of this guy Kian Bexley. He's actually there. It's been difficult, as with anything, to know what's really happening there. People sharing videos from 3 years ago, and so that's why I'm just kind of looking at some of the stuff that he's been doing. And he's connecting even to policies in Canada. Before we started recording this, you and I were talking about Sri Lanka and what there are protests right now, like serious uprising, I guess you would call it, in Sri Lanka, and a lot of that seems economic in nature, but may have deeper connection to policies over there when it comes to farming as well. This is an article from foreignpolicy.com where they're saying that their president promised to transition the country to organic agriculture over a period of 10 years, and that he made good on that promise last April, imposing a nationwide ban on the importation and use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and ordering the country's 2 million farmers to go organic. The result was brutal and swift. Against claims that organic methods can produce comparable yields to conventional farming, domestic rice production fell 20% in just the first 6 months. Sri Lanka, long self-sufficient in rice production, has been forced to import 450 million worth of rice, even as domestic prices for this staple of the national diet surged by around 50%. Ban also devastated the nation's tea crop, its primary export and source of foreign exchange. So what do you think about that? I mean, because you hear it all the time, like, we got to go organic, and it kind of, I think, touches on what you just said.
Allison, what you just read has an internal contradiction in it. He promised to transition to organic in 10 years, and then he banned nitrogen out of the gate. The problem with, the studies that have shown that organic production can actually match conventional production basically translate into looking at soils that are healthy and fertile, soils that have either been not degraded or have been restored. And it's really kind of trying to parse my words here. If you take land that has been farmed in a way that has been intensively using nitrogen fertilizer with cultivars that have been bred for high yield under very nitrogen intensive practices, and then you change it overnight to no nitrogen with the same cultivars, you're going to get a major yield drop, and it's going to really put the farmers at a major disadvantage, you're going to get kind of what that it seems that they're seeing in Sri Lanka. Again, I haven't followed the situation there in detail, but what I have found in the interviews with farmers that I've done who have successfully adopted regenerative practices is that they basically made the transition over time. It wasn't an overnight transition. They had to rebuild the health and fertility of their land before they could get back to comparable yields. They could actually achieve profitability sooner than that because their input costs were greatly reduced. But the idea that you could take land that has been farmed in conventional methods for a long time, long enough to degrade the fertility of the soil, and in tropical regions, there's studies in the journal Nature that document that can happen in just 5 to 10 years. It can happen fairly fast. So if you have lands that have been farmed conventionally for a long time, you need a plan to actually transition farmers to more regenerative methods. And if they're, and not all organic methods are regenerative. That's a key point that I've made in most of my books. There's, plenty of history of societies in the past that did not have what we call conventional practices today that degraded their land, mostly using intensive tillage, lots of plowing over time. So, in both these cases, it sounds to me like that a key mistake was not having actually an effective plan to transition to more regenerative practices over long term. Despite the idea of trying to do it over 10 years, which apparently was the plan in Sri Lanka, just banning a nitrogen fertilizer imports out of the gate is a recipe for agricultural trauma.
Before we get to the rest of this interview, don't forget you can support my work by checking out my sponsors. First, go to AllisonWinePromo.com where you can get 50% off of my favorite wines and 50% off shipping. One of these wines comes from a very small farm where they handpick the grapes. Another comes from almost 9,000 feet. It's an extreme altitude Malbec. The other uses natural fermentation. These are all very unique wines. They come with a very robust flavor. You cannot get these at the grocery store. So go to AllisonWinePromo.com, support my work. But if you're a coffee or tea drinker, then you can also support my work. Check out twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, where you can choose from a wide variety of high altitude USDA certified organic Nicaraguan roasts. There's light roast, there's dark roast, there's a limited black edition right now, which is very good. Also, there is a Caturra tea. If you're a tea drinker, then you definitely got to try this. I cold brew mine for 24 hours. It's actually the fruit around the coffee bean. Very low in caffeine, actually, but you feel good after drinking it. Can't explain it, just gotta try it. So check out AllisonWinePromo.com, twinenginecoffee.com/Allison. Support my sponsors, which keeps me in business, and let's get on with the interview. What are some of the successes that you've seen as you've been writing your books on this topic? What are some of the successes, instead of just focusing on the failures, that you're like, this could work? These are instances where I've seen this work well.
Yeah, well, I mean, to pick up on the Sri Lankan example, one of the farmers that I interviewed in Growing a Revolution was Kofi Boa, who runs the Center for No-Till Research in Kumasi, Ghana. And he had transitioned farmers there off of conventional methods, off of their traditional methods, really, which had greatly degraded their land over time as they ran out of forest to clear. And I'm sorry for the planes that go over here head here every now and then.
Okay. Well, hey, actually, but that brings up another point. That brings up another point, though, because I hear the farmers say a lot, well, what about the airline industry? Or what about this this industry? Why are we always the focus of the crackdowns? So that's actually kind of topical.
Yeah, and I think that farmers have, when we look at the policies that have led to what is called conventional agriculture today, it's a result of 80 years worth of governmental policies and subsidies. And so the last people that you should really sort of blame for that are farmers. They're the ones that are on the receiving end of that. So if you're looking at to change the direction of agriculture, it needs, I think, to be looked at from both bottom down and top up in terms of practices that work for farmers. That's sort of the bottom up. And top down in terms of not so much fiats and mandates as much as rethinking subsidies and the way that we encourage or discourage farmers from particular practices.
Sorry, you never finished your example, I don't think, about the guy you were talking about because the plane flew over your head.
Oh, right. Yeah. So Kofi is basically, he was a really good example of someone who in a tropical environment had figured out ways to do regenerative practices that were working for the farmers that he was working with. He basically taught them to combine no-till methods with cover crops and a diversity of crops. And the farmers that I visited were able to really improve their soil fertility and therefore the amount of food they are growing and their profitability over the course of just a few short years. And that's one of the key things that I've seen, not just on subsistence farms in the tropics, but also on some fairly large farms in the United States and Canada, that the transition to healthier fertile soil does not happen overnight. So you can't just cut the nitrogen off and expect to keep your yields up if healthy soil is what you would need to actually maintain comparable yields. And there's good studies that show that if you have very organic matter rich, healthy fertile soil, adding nitrogen fertilizer doesn't really get you much of a yield boost. But if you have degraded soil, it does. So if you've been using a lot of it and your soil is degraded, and yes, using a lot of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer does degrade soil organic matter over time. If you just go straight from using a lot of it to trying to use none of it, you're going to have a real problem. And that's not a very effective agricultural strategy for managing a transition to more regenerative practices. And what do I mean by regenerative? There's lots of arguments over that term today, but what I mean by it are farming practices that build the health and fertility of the land as a consequence of intensive farming. So it's not necessarily organic, not necessarily chemical free, but a different style of farming than what we see today as conventional agriculture, where we're using lots of synthetic fertilizers to compensate for having already degraded the land. So what I've seen that has been very encouraging to me and turned me into an optimist on the issue of whether we can address the issue of global soil fertility and reduce our dependence on nitrogen fertilizers, not just for the climate issue, but for pollution issues. And it turns out for essentially what gets into our food as well. We have an opportunity to do so, but it's an opportunity that requires thinking about how to do it, carefully planning it, and implementing a transition to a style of farming that is more based on minimal disturbance, keeping such as no-till practices or low-till in organic agriculture. If people are using tillage for weed control in organic, you can get by with that as long as you have a lot of soil organic matter. And so if you have a farm where you have a good source of lots of compost and mulch, say you're near a city and you've got access to a whole lot of organic matter, you can get away with tillage that degrades organic matter because you're refreshing it. So minimizing the chemical and physical disturbance of the soil through minimizing tillage and minimizing chemical inputs, and maximizing the use of cover crops and biological approaches to keeping living plants in the soil to feed the life in the soil, and growing a diversity of crops. And all three of those things are really different than conventional agriculture. And one has to be thoughtful in terms of how one puts a system involving all three together to actually rebuild the fertility of the land, which can take some time. So one of the key things I'd like to see in terms of direct assistance, shall we say, in managing that transition is recognition on the part of agricultural policies and subsidies that we should be helping farmers manage that transition and essentially socializing some of the risks involved in doing that transition, so that more farmers can be interested in doing it. Nobody wants to bet their farm on a technique that is still sort of experimental or hasn't been demonstrated or that they're not sure is going to work. There's a lot that could be done to essentially try and sort of change the level of the playing field, short of fiats and mandates to transition tomorrow morning to a totally different style of farming, which seems to be basically the commonality between your Sri Lankan and Dutch examples. And that's just not a recipe for success.
Do you think it's possible to do that without severely increasing the price of food? I hear a lot of farmers very interested in making this transition, but concerned about the consumer base just not being there.
That's a really good question. There's not a whole lot of research that's been done on what the ultimate price of regenerative foods may be. A very little known fact about organic agriculture is that it's very, very, very profitable in many parts of the world once the transition's made and the soil is fairly healthy. But it's not profitable because it's the costs of production are not such that the last study that I saw basically suggested that the premium on organic food in terms of the cost of production was really only a couple percent. At the market, it's actually higher than that. Why? Because you can get that for it. there's the demand for organic food has greatly exceeded the supply globally. And so it's been one of the fastest growing areas in U.S. agriculture for years. And the profit margins for people who are established and doing it well are actually pretty good. One of the things that really surprised me in researching Growing a Revolution was how many of the regenerative farmers I interviewed basically said that their costs of production were comparable to or lower than that of their conventional neighbors. And their harvests were comparable once they restored the fertility of their land, not straight out of the gate. It took some years to do that, but not decades, a few years. And so that, I'm not 100% convinced that if we were able to magically transform, the world's farmers to regenerative practices tomorrow, and there needs to be a transition. I'm not saying we could do that, but if one was able to,
everyone's going to come with their pitchforks outside your house.
Yeah, I mean, if that was possible, I'm not sure that the price of food would actually go up all that much because the costs of production are not that high. And so if everyone was doing it, market forces would essentially help limit ultimately those prices. The prices that we pay at the grocery store now for conventional foods are incredibly subsidized, particularly for the commodity crops that are grown in the Western world. If we thought about leveling the playing field, regenerative and organic food would not have such a price premium. But maybe we shouldn't be thinking about leveling the playing field, because that would just raise prices across the board. What about if we thought instead about trying to encourage and subsidize practices that left the land in better shape, rather than subsidizing practices that degrade the land over the long run? That could help keep prices down without passing the bill on to future generations, which is basically what we're doing with modern agriculture today.
I had Will Harris of White Oak Pastures, I think is the name of his farm. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He's in Georgia, but I asked him kind of a similar question, and he said that about government role and how you do it. And his short answer was, if you're not going to subsidize the right thing, I wish you just would stop subsidizing anything. I mean, he was kind of on board with you in that regard. He's had a farm. He's fifth generation. I mean, they go way back. And he's seen his farm go from what you're talking about, which was just the way everybody did things 100 or so years ago, to
not quite.
No?
Yeah,
no,
not
it wasn't.
Quite.
Oh,
not
okay.
Quite.
Well,
I mean, there's a lot of romanticism about returning.
You tell us
practices.
about that.
Well, there's a lot of that was what my book Dirt was about. The one that started me in thinking about soils, and
I see.
there's a lot of romanticism about going back to sort of a time when farming practices were
pre-industrial.
Well, pre-industrial, and they certainly were pre-industrial if you go back long enough. But there's a long history of even pre-industrial farming practices degrading the land. What I think is really sort of key today is that we have an opportunity to combine the ancient wisdom of some traditional practices with the modern technology that lets us expand that realm to minimal disturbance on large acreages.
I see.
And that's where there's I think we're at a key inflection point in human history, where we've got the ability to look backward and see what kind of things helped sustain the fertility of the land, but also look forward enough to look at, well, how can we keep doing that in a way that is actually truly sustainable, that could sustain large numbers of people going forward on a revised set of agricultural practices. So I'm always very leery about the idea that, we just need to go back to the way that we were. Because if you look at yields back, 200, 300 years ago, they're not going to support the population we have today. We've got to be smarter about it. And
I see.
There's ways to do that, to combine technology along with wisdom. And it basically boils down, I think, to looking at the science of ecology, not the political philosophy of environmentalism or ecology, but the science of ecology, about how it is that the life in the soil, which evolved with plants, and the symbiotic relationships that Anne and I wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature, how those should be looked at as the foundation for farming practices that could sustain and rebuild the fertility of the land, and even as we try and grow, coax high yields out of the land. And there's ways to do it. I agree very much with Will about the idea that, you know, if we're not going to subsidize practices that build the health of the land, we should at least stop subsidizing practices that degrade it. If you look at agricultural policy from a very broad lens, you know, societal lens, you know, looked at over decades to centuries, it's just crazy to subsidize practices that result in the long-term degradation of native soil fertility and increase our dependence on fossil fuel derived both fuels and agrochemicals. So I think we need to manage the transition, but we need to do it thoughtfully, and we need to do it in a way that's going to actually work for farmers. And I think there's ways to do that, but we have to be careful about how we set that up.
It does seem very hypocritical the way that you're explaining it, that like it seems like I have my toddler and I give her chocolate every morning or something, and then one day I'm like, no chocolate, you know, and I'm smack her for getting the chocolate, but I trained her to want chocolate every morning, you know, where it's it just seems so hypocritical of the governments often to like blame and take severe measures against a system that they created. I mean, maybe not the specific people, like, but over time, and then blame these folks who were just going along with what they were creating for them to participate in. And then it's like, wait a second. I don't know. It does seem very, I guess the best word is hypocritical to me. Just listening to you talk about it.
Well, I think it's, you know, it's short-sighted, and it's not, you know, in any kind of, if you have any kind of sort of policy objective, then you would want to have your subsidies, your regulations, your rules, whatever you're basically implementing to try and further that policy objective, actually be aligned with achieving that policy objective. And you know, basically driving farmers out of business is not going to feed the world. And we need to basically provide them with alternatives that could work for them and that could work for the environment and for human health. And that's where I think that I've become very encouraged by the kind of regenerative practice, by the kind of practices that build soil health. And you know, in regenerative, there's a lot of arguments about the term. I think, though, that the commonality that we need to be thinking about in evaluating farming practices going forward is, how do they relate to soil health? Do they build soil health, or do they degrade soil health? Are they good for the land or bad for the land? Because you can trace that, as we do in What Your Food Ate, right on through to the kinds of things that we find in our food, the phytochemicals, the micronutrients, and the balance of fats that are getting into the human diet. And it strikes me that we would be best served as a society if we looked at our agricultural policies as not just agricultural policies, but also health policies about what it is that we're getting into our diet. If you look at how much we spend on healthcare in the Western world, it's an amazing proportion of our overall expenditures. And it's kind of flipped. Back in the 1950s, we spent half as much on healthcare as we spent on food. It's per capita in the US. Today, it's the opposite. We spend half as much on food as we do on healthcare. So the delivery of, you know, abundant supplies of cheap food have not improved our health. We've spent the last 80 years prioritizing high yields, and there's no question that people need calories to eat, right? There's no question about that. But what we kind of lost sight of was the quality of that food and what's in it. And we inadvertently, through crop breeding and the over-reliance on disturbance, both chemical and physical, undermined the biological relationships between the life in the soil and our crops, and therefore what gets into our plants and our plant foods, but also what gets into our livestock and what then all gets into us. And Anne and I argue in the new book that what we need to do is to basically rethink our strategy agriculturally globally to prioritize building soil health and to focus on not just feeding the world, but nourishing the world. And so we need to develop methods to maintain high yields, but at higher nutrient density. And we think that there's ways to do that we identify and talk about in the book, but there's a long way to go. The idea that we could flip a switch and do it tomorrow morning, or just mandate that farmers do it tomorrow, that's just a non-starter. There's lots to figure out in terms of how to actually implement regenerative practices in different parts of the world for particular crops, how big a difference that might make in nutrient density, which itself, it's highly variable. As you might imagine, there's different levels of different mineral elements in different soils around the world. But there's some commonalities that we talk about in What's Your Food Ate that I think can provide guidance for why we should be thinking about a global program to really try and restore the health and fertility of our agricultural soils as one of the big challenges of this century. And I think that the examples that you're bringing up in terms of the Dutch and the Sri Lankans really illustrate how challenging it is. We can't go about it thoughtlessly. We have to do it if we're going to manage an agricultural transition to more soil-friendly practices over the long run. It needs to be done quite intelligently and deliberately, and in ways that benefit rather than penalize farmers. Farmers can be the hero of this story. There's no reason to villainize them.
It seems as short-sighted as what got us into the issue that they're saying they're trying to deal with. Why do they do it that way then? I'm just curious. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? I know you're not necessarily in, a government, a covert operator or anything, but what's why? What are they doing? If it doesn't seem like it makes sense for agriculture or feeding the world, why are they doing it this way? Why not do it the way you're talking about?
Well, in part because there hasn't been a whole lot of research. I mean, one of the reasons I keep writing books on this subject is when I go out and sort of look in the literature, there's big pieces to sort of pull together and try and synthesize. So if you don't, I don't want to put motives in the minds of people that I've never met, but it's a challenge to basically implement new directions and new ideas if you're not versed in the examples that have actually worked, and there have not been a lot of studies of those. So I've interviewed farmers, traveled the world, looking at farmers who have rebuilt the health and fertility of the land and have ideas about how to do it. Translating that into a national program is a challenge. And I guess that, and probably a geologist is the wrong person to ask about exactly how to do the social policy end of that piece. But I do have enough of a perspective on it to think and to argue that, just mandating that you change tomorrow morning from practices that one has been using for a while is probably not the best way to pull off the transition, let alone to get farmers behind it.
I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me too, but I don't know. Like, what do I know? It's definitely above my pay grade, but the way I look at it is, if they wanted to look at what you're saying, or they wanted to call you up and involve you, or they wanted to put together one of their million different work groups, whatever they call them, they could do it. So I do always kind of question, like, why, it's not a financial subsidy, it's a thought subsidy. Like, why do they make thinking or getting together and working on certain things a priority versus these other areas, especially in the arena of food production? I mean, that's not an unimportant topic. So it just, I don't know. I won't go down that rabbit hole. I also wanted to go down the rabbit hole of animal agriculture, Bill Gates, and like Africa, for instance, saying, there are a lot of countries that have activists that have like banded together to say, we don't want your help anymore. We just want you guys out of here. And I've always thought that's interesting too. Like, what, in the United States, I don't know, we just tend to, not maybe everybody, but I think there's just sort of general idea that like we're advanced and we have all this knowledge to offer, and why don't you want our stuff? Like, why don't you want our stuff? And then there are places that are like, we just don't want it. We just don't want your stuff, and what that dynamic is and everything. But I wanted to, before you go, I wanted to make sure I got in my questions for my audience, because there were a lot of people who had thoughts on this. I remember, I think I've asked you about Dr. Bush before. Are you familiar with him?
I am somewhat familiar with him.
Okay. They were just asking about, are you familiar, and how many people are out there doing this kind of work? If everyone is doing their own thing, is that preventing restorative but regenerative agriculture from scaling up effectively? Could there be more coordination?
Oh, there could definitely be more coordination. There's there's really not, I think, sort of a central thrust or focus on it. I mean, Anne and I have been writing books on this for 15 years and talking about it in various ways and formats. So yeah, some greater coordination would be good. I obviously would encourage people to spread around our books, get people to read about it and think about it. I mean, if you're talking about changing practices, you need to basically think about changing the way people think about subjects, and to change how they're thinking about the soil. We put together a lot of evidence in the books that basically provide people fodder for that. And that's really sort of the role that Anne and I have been playing in I think this space. But there's a lot that could be done in terms of coordination. The Farm Bill is up again. Getting more support for regenerative ideas and practices in the Farm Bill would be an exceptionally good thing to focus on and do. But that requires more organization than Anne and I have as a two-person collaboration of writers.
Okay. Been listening to Joel Salatin on the same kind of info. Didn't know University of Washington put out Smart People still. Is your book on Audible so I can listen? Is your book on Audible so I can listen while working on starting our farm? If you could only raise one animal for agriculture, what animal would you pick and why? So 2 questions. Are you on Audible, and what animal?
Boy, well, yes, all our books are on Audible, and they can be ordered from any bookstore can order them, or from Audible, wherever you like to get your books. They should be available. And if one can't find them, you can always contact Anne and I at our website, dig2grow.com. We don't sell books at it, but we can guide you to people who do. We just have information about our books on that site. If I could only grow one animal, the flippant answer would be worms, but I think that that probably wasn't the intent of the question. It would very much depend on where one's farm was and what other kinds of crops wanted to grow. I'm tempted to basically say cattle. Ruminants can be, if they're managed well, can be real accelerants for soil building. So I think I would go with my favorite ruminant, the cow.
Okay, and you went out for a second. I don't know if it was my internet or yours when you were answering the Audible. So you're saying, yes, it is available on Audible?
Oh, yes, it is available on Audible. Apologize for the home internet here, but
it could be mine.
well, all our books are available on Audible, any independent bookstore, Amazon, any places that you like to get your books. And if you can't find it, you can contact us through our website.
Excited for this interview. I received The Hidden Half of Nature as a gift, and it's in my lineup to read. My question is, what is the best way for the average urban homeowner to start the regenerative agriculture process in their backyard?
Well, that's a question that's probably best put to my wife, Anne, and co-author, who's the gardener in the family. But essentially what the hidden half, the first half of the book, will talk about how she did that to our house in Seattle. And it really involved stopping disturbing the soil and building up organic matter. So in our case, it was lots of compost and mulch. Compost and mulch was the story in terms of building up organic matter, because it's essentially a case of, if you build it, they will come. If you set the conditions by minimizing for beneficial life in the soil, by minimizing disturbance and providing them organic matter, you can rebuild soil pretty fast. It took about 10 years in our yard to go from about 1% organic matter up to about 8 or 9, which is like night and day in terms of soil. And that was in an urban environment, with coffee grounds from the coffee shop, there's a nitrogen source, wood chips from arborists as a carbon source, mixing them in appropriate amounts. Lots of organic matter. The other, so that's what you could do in your sort of your own yard. The other way is to try and support regenerative farmers through your purchasing power, in terms of trying to identify where you want to get your food from. And Anne and I have gone that route in terms of trying to understand what the farmers we buy from are doing on their land. And researching What Your Food Ate really sort of took it to the next level for us in terms of thinking about why we should care about how the people who raise our food are treating their crops and are feeding their crops and treating and feeding their livestock.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something it can actually be difficult to try and access that information if you're not buying stuff from farmers markets, because the signal we have in stores is mostly organic versus conventional, which is
Mm-hmm.
really not necessarily fully informative in terms of how the land on a farm is being treated.
Mm-hmm. Or CSAs are just going straight direct. I mean, I think there are websites out there, like I think Eat Wild is one of them, that help people connect with their local regenerative farmers. And what I tell people all the time is to just call them. I mean, I've literally never called a farmer who's been like annoyed that I called to ask about what they do. That even the ones that aren't even like all the way writing the books, like Joel Salatin or whatever, and doing the podcast thing and the $500 speaking engagements and all that stuff. They love to talk about what they do, even if they wish they could do it better. I've even found that, like, even the ones that are like, we're not totally at the level we would like to be, so maybe we're not, as proud as we could be 10 years from now, but we still want to tell you what we're doing. We want to educate you in our practices. I've never a single time called up a farmer that's been annoyed that I've just asked them. And sometimes they'll even work out arrangements with you that they don't necessarily do, like on a website publicly or a farmer's market or whatever. They're, just get to know people. I mean, that's at the end of the day, I think part of the reason we got into this mess with agriculture is just, it's just a kind of a lack of community and attachment. Not attachment's the best word, but just connection with just people, our neighbors, and not just the land, but like the people around us. We're just kind of isolated and in our own little bubbles. And we work these hours and we come home and we just go through the processes. And now technology has taken over. And I don't know. I've found it to be very rewarding to just pick up the phone or go visit somebody, a farmer, and just learn about them and have a relationship with them. And then ask them, what they have that you might benefit from. And I don't know, maybe you have something they'd benefit from, and you can work out a barter system and totally evade the US currency system altogether and then be a real rebel. Okay, here's a question.
I've found that I have learned so much from the farmers that I've visited around the world by doing what you just advocated, calling them up and asking if I can learn about what they do and have them teach me about what they're doing on their farms. And then, Anne, and my role has been to sort of stand back from that, look across, numbers of farmers and look for commonalities and patterns. But you're right. Farmers who are sort of at the leading edge, shall we say, of thinking about regenerative practices and implementing them, they tend to be, really smart, curious people who are tinkerers, who are trying to improve their land, who have, a relationship with their land and soil as a true steward, as someone people who are wanting to improve their land. And tinkering has been a great boon to the regenerative agriculture movement, I think. And really, that's kind of where I think many farmers who are just starting down the road to regenerative practices really ought to start with sort of a corner of their farm to see how it would work. Don't start with the whole country all at once. Start with like a corner of a farm and try and figure out what practices will actually work and over what time scale, and then figure out how to transition more. I can't tell you how many farmers I've interviewed who started that way, saw the improvements to their land, and then ended up converting their entire farm.
Interesting. Well, yeah, no, and we never finished the story of Will Harris of White Oak Pastures. We were talking about romanticizing the past and everything, but so he was talking about how he's seen his family farm go through that, really all the transitions over the last, say, 150 years that we've witnessed with farming across the country. They had a feedlot on their property. They were, using all kinds of chemicals and stuff. And then he decided, I think, it wasn't just a health thing, but I mean, it was an economic question too, about keeping their farm in business. And I mean, the guy has basically rebooted his whole town. He lives in this small town and now they have like a bed and breakfast, and people come to the farm. They want, it's like farm tourism or something. And he went from a few employees to now he's got, I believe, hundreds of them. I mean, and it's a small town, and it basically, that farm has reinvigorated the entire economy of this town. And it's been really interesting to hear his story about how they did that, and how they went from, like, they've seen it all. They've been through everything that we've talked about, and did it. But yeah, it took time, and it's become even more than just a farm. It's a classroom. It's tourism. It's food production. It's so many different things. It's community, and it's really breathed life back into that area. So it's pretty cool. This question did start with, what do you think government role should be basically in promoting regenerative agriculture? I think we've basically touched on that, but then kind of a follow-up was about educating consumers. What's the role of the consumer, or what's the role of those who educate consumers? How could we do that better? Referencing basically Joel Salatin, Will Harris again, Gabe Brown, Michael Schellenberger. Thoughts on that? How would you do better, and what's the role of the consumer?
Well, I sort of see two avenues for, really three avenues for supporting move towards a more soil-friendly style of agriculture. One of which is, as you were commenting on Will's case, the case that it can be actually better for farmers. It can be better for the bottom line of a farm if you're spending less to grow as much, or even if your yields drop a little bit. If your expenses drop a lot, it can still be more profitable. And then there's also, then you can make the case for reshaping and rethinking agricultural subsidies to encourage practices that take better care of the land, so that so future generations will have the benefit of healthy, fertile soils as well. And then the third leg of that is consumer demand. If people are wanting food that is grown in ways that are not just more environmentally friendly, but have more micronutrients, a better mix of fats in their meat and dairy, those kind of things can actually help spur demand as well. A lot of the science behind that and is what Anne and I go through in What Your Food Ate. So we're hoping that the new book can actually help with consumer awareness and education. There's a lot of links and connections there. Rethinking where one sources one's food to get foods that are grown in healthier, more fertile soils is something one can do to help promote one's long-term health. The jury's still out in terms of exactly how to connect those dots in terms of what a particular change would mean for a particular individual. But I think there's no question, based on the research we put together in the book, I think that there's no question that a more soil-friendly, a more regenerative style of agriculture would be better across the board for human health as well. How much better, we're going to find out if we ever make the transition in a big way. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done on the research end of things, but the flags all kind of point in the same direction from what we can tell by looking at the connections between how the health of the land, how the farming practices affect soil health, the health of the land, how that translates into the health of crops, and the micronutrients and phytochemicals that they contain, how the way we raise our livestock, and particularly in terms of whether they're pasture grazed and raised versus grain fed in a feedlot, that completely changes the balance of omega-6 and 3 fats in meat and dairy in ways that the medical literature suggests have implications for human health, particularly in terms of inflammation and the chronic diseases that are rooted in that. And then how this all translates into human health based on what's in our diet. So what we're trying to do with What Your Food Ate is to get people to think about literally the title. What did your food eat? We don't tend to think about crops as having a diet, but they do in terms of how we treat the soil and what our livestock, how our livestock is raised and what we feed them actually have a big, is not only important for their environmental footprint, which it is, but it's also important for the mix of what's in what then enters the human food supply.
David Montgomery, author of What Your Food Ate. Any final closing thoughts before we go? I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, I would just want to point out and emphasize that I'm not the only author of this book. Anne Biklé, my wife, was wrote it with me, and I'd be remiss not to point that out because we literally argued every word in the book.
Yes, and you know what? Sometimes she should come on too, because we connected at one of the salmon conferences, but I have yet to meet her, so that would be really great. Maybe we'll do a twofer sometime.
Sure, or I mean, it's particularly if you have people interested in how to build the how-to of rebuilding soils in urban environments. She's
Yeah.
my go-to expert on it.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to have her on then to talk about that. I mean, we're in the country, but we're renting before we figure out where we're gonna buy property, and so we've had to be kind of creative with our gardening system here. It's really my first time. Well, we had a garden last year when we were in Cleellum, but we had to move basically right as everything was sprouting, which was kind of annoying. But our landlord decided to sell. So now we're in far eastern Washington and kind of starting over. And you don't want to totally just redo the entire land in your, our landlord has sprinklers and nice grass and stuff. So I don't know what they would think if we just dug it up and started putting mulch down and fertilizer, or not fertilizer, what did you guys say, compost. But yeah, I would love to hear her creative ideas for people who are maybe in unique situations or don't have a lot of land or have to be creative about it. Cause I think a lot of people are getting interested in this topic. I think food is becoming, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, but at least in my circles, food is becoming something that folks are interested in taking more responsibility for, or at least learning a little bit more about how they can be involved in it. And one of the first places to do that is for a lot of people starting a garden.
Yeah, and food is one of those things that we all depend on, and if we, I think we're as a population becoming much better educated on what our food choices mean for our footprint on the environment. If you sort of trace it back upstream, and one of the big messages of What Your Food Ate is that when we think about those kind of questions and how our food choices relate to the health of the environment and to our own health, we should not only be thinking about what to eat, but we should be thinking about how it was raised. Because a plant-based diet that's raised in ways that destroys the land is not better than a diet that has some animal products in it that are raised regeneratively in ways that actually heal the land. So I think we're arguing that we need to go sort of take one step back, in effect, and ask, well, how was our food raised, and what does that mean? What does that matter for both environmental issues and for our own health?
Yeah, and another topic I think that's come to the forefront for a lot of people is food security and just the resilience of a food system. And I think COVID was just one sort of instance of how vulnerable our food system is to disruption. And so I think there's a lot of interest too from people to, I don't know if you would call it necessarily decentralizing it or what, but just, I remember Will, when he came on, what he kept talking about was resilience, like having a more resilient food system. And in his opinion, going regenerative increases your resilience to all kinds of problems.
Yeah, in terms of resilience to disruption of the nitrogen fertilizer supplies, sort of the top of the list these days, but also in terms of drought resistance, that's a big issue. And the other issue in terms of resilience is that we're very dependent on just a few key grain crops. We've lost the diversity in our diet as well, but that's perhaps a topic for another day.
Okay, good tease for the next time. All right, David, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks, Allison. It's a pleasure talking to you.